All right. So for today's episode, I get to sit down with someone who's a good friend of mine and a colleague that I actually work with in my day job at Ledgex Software, and get to hear a lot of great stories that he has, because there's a lot of them. We've spent some time together and heard some of those. Talking about being a flight instructor, things like working at NASA, and then getting into what we do now and what we like about it, what we don't like about it, and all that kind of great stuff. So thanks for sitting with me,
Yeah,
Chris.
I'm excited to be here.
So, just diving right in. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in a small town on the North Shore of Massachusetts called Manchester.
Mm-hmm.
Some people affectionately refer to it as Manchester by the Sea.
Okay.
Those of
Only
us.
some people?
Yeah. Well, the name was legally changed years ago.
Okay.
But those of us, I'm actually a fourth generation
Oh, wow.
person who grew up in Manchester. My father lives in the house that my grandfather grew up in. But the name was actually changed in 1980 something.
Why?
Legally was changed to Manchester by the Sea. I don't know. The argument was that, people were confusing it with Manchester, New Hampshire.
Oh, we need to stand out.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Small town?
Small town, 6,000 people.
Oh, wow. That is small.
There was actually a movie made about
Yep.
it called with the same name, Manchester by the Sea, a few years ago. It was a very depressing movie,
Yes.
which doesn't reflect my childhood at all. It was actually a very
You
pleasant.
like growing up in a small town?
Yeah, it was very pleasant. It's a quaint little oceanfront town. Grew up fishing on the docks, catching flounder and
Yeah,
bluefish.
big fishing town, right?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's, for as small and evolved a town it is, there's still, 20 or so commercial lobstermen who
Oh, wow.
work out of the harbor. I grew up there. McCoy is a big name in town.
Okay.
Everyone knows my family. My Uncle Craig has been president of the Boosters Club there.
Yeah.
He's been president of the Manchester Club. My dad has been involved in various organizations. And my mother worked at a small private school there for years.
So your mom's a teacher?
She was actually the headmaster's assistant.
Oh, okay.
And
I feel like that could be an even more ominous job.
some people would say that it was a more important job, right? Because you had to have a certain kind of personality.
Yeah.
She had the gift of keeping secrets, which I think
Oh.
is important in a role like that. So.
Okay.
But yeah, the school was like a mile from the house. My father worked in the next town over in Beverly. And all my friends were kids of people my parents grew up with.
Okay. Yeah.
So, it was a very kind of close, small
A lot of
situation.
siblings?
I have one brother,
Okay.
older brother. He has been the head of facilities and groundskeeping at Boston College for a
Okay.
while. So a big Boston College connection over there. We're, pretty close. We get along really well. Not all siblings do that, so
And you're still local to the Boston area.
Yep.
Decided to kind of stay close. Do you see yourself going back to Manchester or staying where you are now?
Well, it's interesting because my wife and I live, in what's considered Metro West, which is due west of the city. The way it's worked out is the family home that we live in has been it was originally built as a large single family home. It was turned into a 2-family home a few years back, and my brother and I share it on weekends, like every other weekend, because there's beautiful beaches and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a little getaway for my wife and I. So yes, we're there all the time today. So
Yeah.
it's a town over from the airport that I flight instruct at. So
Okay.
it's nice to kind of go up
Close
there.
to where you want to be.
Exactly.
basically. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. And so, growing up, did your mother being kind of the headmaster's assistant, show at home too? Was there,
My mother was very good at leaving work at work.
Oh,
So
good.
yeah, she was.
But she wasn't like overly strict because this is,
Not at all.
Really?
Not at all. No, my mother was very, always there for baseball games, very caring kind of person. Certainly, attended to everything my brother and I needed and was not overbearing. My brother might tell a different story. My mother
Older
and my
child,
brother kind of, exactly.
Yeah.
Older child. There's a fair amount of friction between them at times. But no, she had a large capacity for love. And while I was growing up in that house. My grandmother actually lived on the second floor.
Oh, wow.
An interesting story about my grandmother, who lived to be 97 years old.
Nice.
For years, she worked for a woman named Mrs. Hood. And if you're from the Boston area at all, you know Hood Milk and Hood Ice Cream. It was that Mrs. Hood.
Oh, wow.
And for years, she cooked all her meals. She would have big dinner parties.
Oh, wow.
Mimi, we called her Mimi, would go over and cook all those meals and did all like the preparation for foods. And Mrs. Hood always had food to be consumed. Mm-hmm. So my grandmother and I were very close, living in the same house. And I mean, I learned a lot of life from my grandmother.
Yeah, so you had like extended family under the same roof. That's nice.
And she was the one with my mother working, was always there when I got home. And, I have a couple of funny memories of, finagling her to play basketball with me in the backyard. And, ball going in the hoop and hitting the ground in the wrong way and kind of bouncing back and smacking her in the head.
In the face.
Yeah.
Nice. Trying not to laugh.
Yeah, but, one of the things that I really think has kind of framed me in life in general is I love to cook. Mm-hmm. People always ask me why I love to cook.
That's where that comes from?
And that's where it came from. My grandmother was always happiest in the kitchen. Okay. And I kind of get that passion from her for sure.
Wow, that's interesting. And did you play a lot of sports growing up?
Well, Manchester being a small town like it is, only 6,000 people. I graduated with 72 kids, about 40 boys. So I always make the joke that you almost had no choice but to play sports because once the coaches, So I played football, basketball, and baseball. Wow. I was a quarterback in football. I was guard in basketball, and I pitched and played shortstop in baseball.
Like through your whole school career?
Yep. I because it was such a small town, small school. I mean, I played varsity sports for 4 years in all three sports. Yeah. So I also had, you make the joke about the name McCoy. My dad and my grandfather, my dad and my uncles were all football people. Yeah. My cousins, my brother was a wonderful football player.
But all from the same town.
Yes. Yeah. All from the same town. My father, interestingly enough, was the last class at Manchester High School to play what was at the time was called six-man football. They literally played with six players. 6 people. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because every now and then they have a reunion, like all the people on the North Shore who played six-man football go back and they watch these old films. Wow. It's funny because my Uncle Artie was a center. If you know anything about football, it's like an interior lineman. Mm-hmm. But his claim to fame was he played center, and he led the team in touchdown catches that year, which is not something that happens in modern-day football. Yeah. So, I kind of inherited it from that. It was a choice. It picked me more than I picked it.
Well, I understand that. I was talking to Amanda on one of the other episodes, and same thing, like growing up in a town like that and growing up in a big family. Yep. Like, I had that same experience that, I grew up in the town where my parents grew up. And my father was, big into sports in town. Yep. And so it's it was a natural, well, of course your kid's going to play sports because, you were so great. Clyde's daughter has to play sports. Yeah. And so it was the expectation. Yeah.
And when you, couple that with the fact that you're from Boston, which has, such a rich sports tradition.
Yeah, heavy
with the professional sports teams. I mean, my father was a huge Bruins fan growing up, and had season ticket. He jokes all the time because it costs him $80 for the year. But he was there, this infamous goal that Bobby Orr scored where he's flying across the sky. My father was at the game. Oh, wow. And at some point we got him a picture of the goal being scored.
That's cool.
And somehow tracked down Bobby Orr and had it signed. So if you go to their house, my dad sits in his chair, and there's a picture of Bobby Orr signed by Bobby Orr. Yeah.
Nice.
So that was pretty cool.
So what would you want to be when you grew up, when you were growing up in Manchester?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Did you want to grow up and leave? Was that always kind of a dream, or was it no, I want to...
Those are two interesting questions. I'll handle the first one first. So when I was very young, I grew up having no idea what it was, but I always had this obsession with being an oceanographer. had no idea what
It's like
what
you're
that
on the
showed.
beach and near the ocean. so,
Fishing
okay.
and water, and yeah, that was kind of what I thought. But at some point, um, I had an inclination. I was good in math and sciences, so I was always thinking that I was going to go be an engineer or something
Okay.
like that. And then like my junior year of high school, I guess
Like a
it was.
building bridges type of engineer?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Well, it was either building bridges or plastics. My father
Okay.
was in plastics, and mold making and stuff like that. So I always had an interest in that kind of a thing. But I don't know. I guess like my junior year of high school, we had like a career day, and people came in and spoke to us. And there was this one person who came in and spoke who was a Delta Airlines pilot.
Interesting.
And he told stories of, being an airline pilot and what that was all. And it sounded kind of interesting. And then he kind of transitioned into stories about, he had been a fighter pilot in Vietnam.
Okay.
And, like what that whole experience and the military experience was like. So at that point, I kind of went off on a tangent where I really thought I wanted to be an airline pilot.
Okay.
It was right around the time Top Gun came out, too.
Okay,
So,
yeah,
that,
so-
there's a little bit of
Yeah.
extra.
But did you ever think you wanted to go in the military to do it, or was it always commercial?
Well, that was
there?
what I kind of I researched first. I looked at, ROTC programs. I looked at going to the academy. At the time, getting like pilot slots was very challenging. Like the pilots going into the Air Force and Navy and whatever it was very challenging. And I don't know, I probably spent more time in sports than I did academics.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
like it was clear that wasn't going to be a thing.
Yeah.
So I eventually, our local university and like college system had a 2-2 program with a state college for aviation science. So I went to a community college and studied aviation science originally. And my goal was fully going to be, I was going to be an airline pilot. So
Okay.
I got an associate's degree and a commercial pilot's license and instrument ratings, and was on that track. And then found my way through college, and ironically enough, went to work for these people who owned this small plastics molding company,
Okay.
and they had a computer and no one knew how to use it. And so I started solving problems for these people's small business with computers.
So you got sucked into computers.
Yeah, exactly. Whether it was inventory, like that, all these parts laying around, they never, someone would call in, they could never find them. So I created a whole system where they would use a database and we would mark the inventory and would find it. And then there was like a whole other program that they were trying to use about, CAD design and reading plans and stuff they didn't know how to use. So I figured that out and trained them. And so, while I was working through all this, I, like you said, stumbled into
Got the
computers.
computer bug.
Yeah.
And
And-
like, so did you find though that because it's not, I mean, well, knowing kind of where the story goes, like it eclipsed then becoming an airline pilot, obviously. But so is it like you were immediately drawn to not just the computer aspects of it, but the problem solving part of
Yes.
it, and like that is
Yeah.
totally different than going and flying a plane, which is
Well, there was
Totally
a couple of things going on. One is, as I was finishing up my aviation degree, I was starting to have children. So the idea of traveling the world became less exciting
Yeah.
to me.
yeah.
So there was that. The other thing was the airlines at this time were very challenging to get pilot slots. Like today we have this pilot shortage, and like these guys are like paying these kids
Yeah,
who
they're
have
hiring
almost no
everybody, yeah.
hours to finish their training. Back in the day, it was you would go for like an interview, you'd get a slot, and then you had to pay your own training.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was like you'd have to take out a loan for $25,000,
Yeah.
and then you'd go fly like small twin props out of Plattsburgh, New York,
Yeah.
and like you'd be in debt for years.
Yeah.
And like there's all sorts of stories of those days of like 3 and 4 pilots living together in houses because it's the only way they could afford to live. So that was a problem.
Also did not sound attractive.
No.
once you were married.
And then,
Yeah.
I got the computer skills. And at the time, like the whole mutual fund industry was blowing up. Like Scudder was a thing. Fidelity, Putnam, all these huge firms that were Boston and New York based were kind of blowing up, and there were ads everywhere. And so as soon as I put a resume out there with some computer skills it happened to be Scudder, Stevens & Clark, which was one of the oldest mutual funds on Wall Street, I got scooped up almost instantly.
Oh, wow.
So I always make the joke that financial services and computers found me. I didn't find it. So
sounds like it for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I kind of begrudgingly gave up on the aviation dream at the time. It just seemed like a more sensible, I'm going to go do this thing for a while. And,
more realistic kind of like,
I can always go back to that. And it was a little sad because, the path to aviation at that point was through flight instructing. And I was working on my flight instructor certificate at the time, and I didn't get it. I stopped.
Oh, really?
I
you just stopped doing it altogether.
Yeah, I did at the time.
So you totally went I'm not doing what I set out to do, and I'm going over this direction.
Exactly right. So it was funny. I took this low-level job at Scudder, Stevens & Clark. They had just started a 401k record-keeping group.
Okay.
And at the time, the big thing was, they were running all these on the plans on mainframe computers.
Okay.
But they had this process where they had to take the results of that plan, put it onto a data tape, and mail it to a print vendor so you could get your quarterly statement.
Oh, wow.
So that was my first job.
This is back in the day.
I was like a 9-track data tape jockey for the first year of my career. Which was kind of interesting because I was connected to a group that they called it. They called the group, what was the name of that group? I don't even remember, but it was something like, it wasn't operations, but it was like fulfillment or something like that.
Yeah.
And the whole group, put out statements. They also data processed. So, these plans would send in these large files and all these different file formats, and you'd have to do a little manipulation to get in the right format to upload it to the mainframe so the plan administrators could work on the data.
But this is all back in the day. You're not manipulating in Excel. This is code manipulation.
No, it was all DOS prompts. Running batch files and DOS prompts. And what was interesting about it at the time, though, is this group, we had to manage all this process. And there was 400 statements passing through that group every quarter. We were doing 100 data files a day that were passing through there. So we would start to kind of experiment with using other tools to help with the process. So, enter Microsoft Access. So, we started building little internal applications in our group to both, maintain what statements we had processed already, what still needed to be processed, we set up a little environment where people could request stuff that would come in there. And I just had a knack for that kind of
so the problem solving and how to use build new tools, use the tools you got.
Exactly.
To kind of just
make
it happen.
To keep things happening. And then an interesting thing happens where we switched print vendors at that time. So we were working with one, we're going to go with this other, and this thing that I'd never heard of called FTP became a thing. And I was like, well, what's that? And it's like, well, now we're not going to send 9-track tapes. We're going to transmit files over to this new print.
Tech.
Yeah, it was cool. But this program that the programming group had set up for us to process the statements, was all based upon writing these 9-track tapes. It wasn't about transmitting files or any of that kind of stuff. And they needed
it's totally different.
And they needed it in different formats and that kind of stuff. So the programming group, told us they were going to build us this solution to manage the process. Of course, it got delayed. And I had this amazing manager. I have been blessed with amazing managers my whole career.
Good role model manager type.
Yeah. And he was very empowering. It was like, I went into his office one day and I'm like, this thing's going to take forever to do. I think we could just build it in Access. And he was like, well, talk to me about that, And it was the first flow diagram I think I ever drew. So I'm on his whiteboard and I'm like, we're going to do this and do this. And I drew the whole picture out and then the files are going to end up here. And then we can use this solution to transmit them to the thing. And he's just like looking at me. He goes, but like if we do that, like the programmer group's going to be all mad at us because like they control the process. I'm like, the beauty of it, Marshall, that was his name, Marshall. Because the beauty of it is I can update all the databases their program's going to be and they'll never know we're not using their program.
Nice.
And he was like, I really like the sound of that.
Even better.
So I don't know. I spent a whole weekend one time just like hammering away at this thing and came back on Monday and like showed it to him. And he's like, this is the coolest thing ever. We should just use this. And so that was like the first like
I mean that does sound lucky though that you had the right boss to kind of like embrace that kind of thought process. Was everybody else kind of around you like that, or everybody else around you was very much like the?
It was a mix. It was a mix of people. It was, some people were very rigid and like, oh, you're going to tell me what to do. I want to do this thing.
Yeah, because I mean these are mutual fund companies back in the day too. Like they're not known for flexibility, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
I mean, I think Scudder Defined Contribution Services actually spun out of Scudder Trust Company, which was, where that world is.
Yeah.
It was even more rigid and people had been there a million years. And so, like, I was just this kind of person who liked to tinker with radios, I always like to say, who found myself in a group with some problems to solve.
Yeah.
And, it was empowering for me to do. And self-taught. I taught myself SQL
and
that's
what I find really impressive about it is that it was just again, it's a problem solving. Like, what do I have to learn
exactly
to solve the problem?
Exactly. And well, that's a whole other story, but we'll get to that one.
But so like, what then made you kind of move on from there, and like, where'd you go from there? Because now you have a pretty marketable skill set at this point, because again, it's still in the day where there's not a lot of people who can do that.
Exactly. And they were hiring anyone and training them to be programmers. So what kind of happened was in any entry-level job you get, like you walk in the doors with a certain title, people figure out that you're the person. Like what would happen is people would start circumventing my coworkers because they know I was going to say yes, or
you're the guy that
I would figure it out. I was, the smart college educated person in the group. And so I started to get frustrated with that. And so to your point, there was great opportunity for tech people at that time. I started to look outside of Scudder. First application I put out, I had like an interview the next day, and then went to my first interview, and it was actually at a large life insurance / annuity company.
Okay.
And at the time, they were
not as exciting.
Not as exciting. But what was interesting is the guy who hired me. Another amazing manager, still gives me like references and whatever, like to this day. He was the assistant treasurer in a treasury control group in this large annuity company, and wasn't getting what he wanted out of his programming group and wanted to basically hire kind of a problem solver. I went to work. Well, I got the job offer. I went back to Scudder and told him I had a job offer. And like the head of kind of the whole tech group, like called me into his office and was like, tell me what you want to do. Like whatever job. You want to be a programmer? Like whatever you want. Like everyone in this building loves you.
Oh, wow. And
like all the plant managers don't want you to leave. And I was like, his name was Gene. I remember that clearly. I'm like, Gene, that like, I'm never going to be able to get out from under the fact that I'm the statement production guy. Like, I could be the biggest programmer here ever. Like Carl is still going to come look for me and ask for me to print his statement that those other guys can't figure out how to do. I need to leave.
There's just no career path. Like you were now pigeonholed. Yeah.
Yeah. And so he's like, totally understand, said good luck. And I left there and went to work at this annuity company. It's Keyport Life Insurance, who eventually got absorbed by Liberty Mutual.
Oh, okay.
They were like the inventor of the fixed income annuity or the variable income annuity. I can't remember. They invented one of them. I think it was the variable one. And then like all these other companies followed suit and took the business away. But
so, I mean, did that mean then because they're now creating products that you had to then code for products, like new products that they're creating? Is that something that you were like involved in?
Well, it was interesting because, as I mentioned, John, who was the head of this group or the assistant treasurer, his whole thing was he couldn't get kind of attention from the applications group. So I went in and he just had like random stuff for me to solve.
Okay.
Like they didn't have a travel and expense thing. But yet all these sales guys were traveling. He wanted to track that. I created an access database to do that for them. And then it would be like weird things where I would just like sit with people in the treasury group and watch what they did. And I'd be like, John, I think we can do this.
That better.
The one I remember, there was this guy, he was a business analyst, and he would sit and try to transmit ACH files to Bank of America like all day, his whole day. I mean, he would do other things. He'd start it and then he'd leave and he'd start and come back, start and come back. And I said to John, I'm like, I think I can write a program that will just like, just keep trying to send these files to. And so we did it I did it. And it was like the coolest thing because this guy would start it in the morning and then he'd come back at the end of the day and see if it ran.
Yeah.
And it's funny because, somewhere along the line, I had a job interview and someone said, what is it you like about program? Which I always thought was like an excellent interview question. And I compared it to, I said, to me, like programming is about like painting your kitchen. Because like so many people want to redo their kitchen. They want to rip out cabinets and they want to, do new hoods and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But sometimes if you just take a gallon of paint and put a new color on it, it feels
different. Yeah.
And that's how that was what I really loved about like programming. It was
that type of programming, yeah.
Solving people's problems. I loved kind of being in the trenches and helping and an immediate effect kind of stuff, like using a computer to solve problems. But I was there about like a year and a half, and I recreated, that was when I started learning about web programming. We did ASP forms where like we could recreate tax documents from tax files so that like a person could look someone's tax form up online because, of course, it's annuities. That's what people are excited about.
Yeah. But so I mean, I know this about you, just that problem-solving aspect of it is really what drives you, and being able to sit down with someone across the table and dig into, what they do in a day, what problems do you have, let me make it better, right? Like that's just something.
It was everything.
But, and that's kind of really what makes you happy during the day is when you get to do that kind of work.
It's everything for me, yeah.
But I can't imagine that you got a lot of satisfaction and a lot of that feeling out of working for NASA.
Well, that's an interesting transition too. Yeah.
I mean, as much as you think, and I use this analogy all the time, like sometimes you just got a NASA problem and say, this is the stuff we have, let me figure out how to make it work.
Yeah.
Organizationally, it doesn't really seem like that kind of.
Well, it was interesting. So I ended up at Cape Canaveral on I had chosen to move to Florida and I was looking for jobs and of course had the aviation background and this job came up.
Oh, really? Is that what? Did that help you get the job at NASA?
Oh, like 100%.
Okay.
Mostly because on the application there was a question that says, "Why are you interested in working at NASA?"
Oh, okay.
And I, gave them my whole background, aviation, love. The Right Stuff was one of my favorite movies growing up. So I really have always enjoyed the early origins of NASA and that kind of stuff. So
yeah.
So I decided to move to Florida. I see this job come up, and it's working on a large data integration project at NASA. A lot of people don't know this, but the government, other than like the shuttle programs back in the day, the government really doesn't launch anything. They provide a platform for contractors to come and launch. So at the time that I was arriving at NASA, there was like 30 or so contractors that worked at Cape Canaveral. Okay. And the problem was the government needed to basically collate or aggregate all the information, whether it was, POs or budgeting or so, because they could never, there would be like a building, the SPIF, call it the Spatial Integration Facility or something like that. They had this building and they were always trying to figure out how much money they were spending to maintain that building. But
I see it. No idea how much it costs.
Exactly. And so they had to go to say 8 different contractors, get all their information to try to figure that out. So the problem that they were trying to solve for is how do I create a central kind of architecture to tap into all these different data sources and pull it into a central view? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's funny because the person who was running that project was trying to do it on a shoestring budget. And they were using a program called the SIBR program, which was Small Business Innovative Research. So the government loves to give money to small businesses. So you could get these contracts. If you could get a project kind of written into a contract, you could use smaller contracts to plus up the funding, essentially. So I was on one of those small contracts. It just happened that our small contract was kind of the hub of it. So we worked with everyone at the base to try to get their information. So there were aspects of it that were amazing, right? Like, because all the government people were great because they were like, hey, you know, we want to share our information. It's really important to solve for this problem. It was great. But like when you got out into the larger ecosystem where you started going to Boeing and saying, hey, you know, it says in your contract you're supposed to give us data, they'd be like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that because competitive information and all sorts of stuff. So it was both awesome at times because when you got access to what you needed, I loved it. And I learned about technologies I didn't know anything about. But on the bigger picture, it was very frustrating.
Bureaucratic.
Very bureaucratic. I always make the joke that, you know, people always say, hey, you know, back in the day, remember they were talking about how the government spent $500 on a hammer? Well, I always like to say the government doesn't spend $500 on a hammer. They spend $50 on the hammer. They spend $450 proving that they spent $50 on the hammer.
Figuring out that they spent $50.
The oversight and that kind of stuff was what became frustrating. But, I mean, the list of things that I saw that I never would, like I used to go and eat lunch where like the Mercury program launched every day, you know, like where John, Glenn, and all these guys took off. I mean, it was amazing. I would be like the only one sitting there too, like in my car eating a ham sandwich. And then we got involved with emergency, what was called the command center, like because the Air Force is also there. And we got involved with their whole, you know, managing the base through these things they called sit reps every day. There's situation report. And through that, we got access to the LCC. So I watched launches from the Launch Control Center on both the Air Force side and at NASA. You know, I watched night launches with generals who you know the name of. There was one time where the commander at our base at the time was a woman who had at some point held the record for the longest spacewalk. Like she was a former astronaut. She had left the Air Force and then come back after her NASA experience. And I watched a launch one day from her front yard. She was having like a cookout.
Oh, wow.
And it was the most surreal experience because you're just standing there and she's like, okay, now, you know, the main boosters are kicking in and the shuttle is starting to lean back and you feel like you're going to fall over. And then all of a sudden, you know, the thing and like explaining Max Q and like all this stuff. And it was like, I almost had to pinch myself because it was like the experience of a lifetime. But
that's cool. But like, I don't know, like we work together and we both kind of feel the same way about anytime there's bureaucracy or politics involved in something that we're trying to do. It just becomes problematic for people like you and I because it just gets in the way of problem solving. Right? Like, like what are we even doing anymore? We're just talking about it. We're not even.
Well, and that's the thing is like the early days of NASA and the Cape, like it was all about that. Like it was trying to, like, you know, President Kennedy set a goal, you know, and like people really bought into it. It was a different time then and it was all new and, you know, from what I understand, it was an amazing time to be there. I didn't have that full experience.
By the time you got there, that was not what was happening. Because it just became like a day-to-day thing, that overarching kind of mission.
Well, and as a self-motivated person, like I wanted to be moving in a direction, like, you know, like I was still like in my 30s, you know, my kids were still fairly young and I was, you know, I was trying to do something with my life. And I just felt like, you know, I was kind of spinning my wheels there because of what you're talking about.
How'd you feel about living in Florida coming from small town Boston area?
It was a change.
Different.
It was a change. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
And
funny.
not just like climate wise, but yeah.
Well, it's funny because like my best friend in the world now is someone I met down there. He was just an amazing person. He's actually, it's really kind of funny because he's a fourth generation Floridian, which
Also, you never know. Yeah.
never happened. And his father was like a local doctor, and everyone knows him in town. He's the most reasonable kind of person. And he just hit it off. He's also a pilot as well. So, that aspect of it was amazing. Like I do everything I can to see him once or twice a year because he's just like, I really think the world of him. But that wasn't my comprehensive experience down there.
Yeah,
There's
that was fleeting. Sounds like, yeah.
there's a lot
So
of
did you go right? Did you leave there and go back to the Boston area?
yeah. So it's interesting because the NASA thing kind of worked its way out. I had this friend who I'd worked at a company called Thompson Financial with years and years ago, who was also a dear friend. And he called me one day. I was like driving to the Cape, and he's like, "Hey, do you want to be a consultant?" And I'm like, "Okay, sure," because I had run its course at that point. And so he had worked for a company called Castle Integration. He was starting a new group that was consulting group, and they had this large client who popped up in Texas, and he was like, "Oh yeah, you could just commute to Texas every other week, and we could start doing this thing."
Why not?
So,
But commuting from Florida or commuting from Boston?
so that was the reason I'm telling you the story. Originally, I was commuting to Texas from Florida. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Which had its benefits in some way because like no one travels for business in Florida.
Yeah, it's a different yeah.
So like I always had status, flying out of Orlando, which was a different experience than when I went to Boston.
Yeah.
But that whole thing lasted about 2 years, and when it kind of finished, we started the company you and I both work for now. And that's
But again, it like started as a consulting project. Like
It
that
did.
is the what I find interesting is like it always the genesis of kind of what you've historically worked on always starts with I'm going to go solve a problem.
Yes. Well, that was just what I was going to say because for problem solvers, it was like the biggest, most massive problem to solve I had ever encountered. And it went on for a long time, and it was fulfilling. I met amazing people. I knew nothing about Texas, but I spent, almost 3 years there every other week. And we solved people's problems on a level in which I had never had the ability to. Like
You did have some exposure, I'm guessing, through like Scudder to kind of the investment type of environment.
Yes.
But this is kind of, next level type of investment client.
Yes. Yeah, they were a hedge fund. And it was funny because I also went to graduate school when I was in Florida. And I got my MBA, and the last class I took was finance, and I had to write a paper, and I wrote about hedge funds.
Okay.
So
Lucky.
2 months later, I was working at a hedge fund, and it was, I pulled a lot of the experience I had back in Scudder and Keyport Life Insurance.
Definitely a different environment than a government-run
Oh my God. Oh my gosh.
organization, for sure.
Hedge fund people are a lot different than government people. Yeah.
It is
I had very
it's a different
positive
environment.
experiences though, because they were very, I wouldn't call them demanding, but they had high expectations.
Sure.
They really needed problem solved. They had no technology infrastructure. They were hanging together on about 500 Excel spreadsheets, a problem we both know very well. And, I had a real ability to make an impact with some people I ended up really liking a lot.
Yeah.
But it did all come back to the problem solving.
Yeah.
Yes,
In the end. Yeah. And you got to learn a lot about barbecue.
I did. That's very true.
Take your original love of cooking to like a different level that you didn't experience.
Yeah, I didn't even knew what brisket was until I started going to Fort Worth.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. Now, as you know, I'm an obsessive smoker of brisket and everything else, red meat and meat wise.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's funny the things that you get from different life experiences that you don't.
Well, it's just also one of those things like when you find a place where, you just are enjoying the people and you're enjoying the environment and the atmosphere and getting fulfillment out of what you're doing, just like all of the other stuff that kind of comes with it. Right?
Yes.
That's like unexpected.
Well, and it's funny because just like my Florida experience, I still have a dear friend who we actually hired into this firm. That was part of the job we had to do was hire a CTO. Him and I are still great friends, speak once a month, and joke back and forth about a lot of different stuff. So,
yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that like I've always kind of noticed about your approach to, just business and working with clients.
Yeah.
Is, it's the problem solving aspect of it, but also like it's on a much more personal level, right? Like, and I mean, a lot of, if you're going to be a good problem solver, you kind of got to get to that level with somebody and be kind of, like I said, sitting across the table and understanding somebody's perspective. So, I mean, it happens, right? But I think it's indicative of the fact that you really kind of are putting yourself out there and looking to kind of take on somebody else's problem.
Well, it's an interesting thing because the friend I started that business with, Brian, he's always been a very business, sales oriented, drive full ahead kind of person. I've always been much more touchy-feely, if you bet. And it's funny because people have asked me, in the past, because you've seen me with clients, like, Brian's great at meeting people. I'm great at being your friend forever after I meet you. And people have asked me, like, where'd that come from? And it's funny, when we started this conversation, the biggest day of the year in Manchester is 4th of July. Okay. 4th of July, the whole town shuts down. There's no drinking laws. Everyone just kind of walks around this quaint little oceanfront town because there's a big parade and fireworks. And it just so happens that my family home that my father still lives in is right at the end of the parade route.
Right in the middle of everything. That's awesome, actually.
And so for years, everyone just came to the house. Like we'd have 120 people on the front lawn, and Mom would cook a big breakfast. We'd have Bloody Marys. I mean, we still do it to today. But my dad has this thing where, like, if you bring someone new as they're leaving that first time, he always says, well, you've been here once now. You are always welcome back. You're part of the,
the now you're on the list. Yeah.
And I kind of feel like that's how he has approached life, and it's how I've kind of approached life.
I can see that.
I mean, you were talking about specific clients yesterday and, possibly transitioning one to someone else, and you saw like the look on my face, the idea of giving someone up. Yeah. So to me, it's all about relationships. Like it's all about relationships as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I've always really taken an interest in the people I'm trying to solve problems for, because, I think that's what motivates me. It's the people.
So is that the aspect that you've kind of found, most fulfilling, kind of, being at Ledgex? I mean, you're the founder of Ledgex, right? So like that's, the genesis of it is the story that you just told, but is that kind of what made you say, I want to do this kind of for more people and, the thing that kind of keeps you doing it?
It is. It really, it's all about relationships. I mean, not to say, but yeah, I mean, I like solving problems, and I like this particular problem to solve. Finance has always been this big thing that I always, like when I was younger, I looked up to,
and the technology aspect of it.
And we grew up during the Wall Street movies and other people's money was another favorite of mine. So understanding markets and how that all worked was what kind of really attracted me to financial services first. But I've really just enjoyed the people I've met through the years. I still talk to many of them, even if they're not clients anymore. I still talk to a lot of people who worked at Ledgex who have moved on. We've maintained those relationships. So I think really that is the driver for me, and I see it in a lot of different places. In parts of my life.
Yeah, I mean, you're also the guy, like, even like you said, if somebody's not a client anymore, they still call you up and ask they know you're a problem solver, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, Chris, I got this problem.
Yeah.
You know, you might not personally be able to help me, but you know,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
you know anybody that can, right? And
Yeah.
like, that's something that, yeah, I've known you to do, you know, and I think just permeates kind of the organization that we have, in that not trying to be all things to everybody, but work with
Yeah.
whoever's necessary to solve the problem, right? And like, it's not, you're not the guy looking to be proprietary about everything. It's, you know, no, like, we want to work with other people. We want to be able to integrate with other people and, you know, other organizations, other software, other platforms. You know, I mean, it's necessary in order to keep up, but it's also just necessary to have the relationships and to be able to maintain business.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's just the right way to do business, and not just try and be.
Yeah, I mean,
you can't talk to anybody else. You have to do everything through.
Well, it's funny because we had a client who we got on very early on in the beginning of Ledgex's history, and he was a client I really loved working with. I loved the firm. I liked him. He was really engaged with it, and then through they were a client 8 or 9 years, and then through a weird set of circumstances, the founder of that firm just decided they were going to close one day.
Okay.
And it's a name, if you're in the fun,
industry, you would know.
You would know. It was a big story at the time. But like he has like a Masters pool, an NCAA pool every year, and not only am I still doing it, my dad does it,
Oh, wow.
my son does it. So yeah, I mean, I have friends on Facebook who are clients who, you know, I start conversations out about their sons playing golf and things like that. Yeah, it's always been hard for me to kind of keep working and friendship and stuff.
Oh, yeah,
separate.
like, just because, well, that's, you know, I think that's personality-wise, but I also think is what makes you so effective in doing it. What are your favorite kinds of problems to solve today in, like, this day and age?
Yeah, you know, so technology is always a challenge to kind of keep up with. It's what motivated me in the beginning. It's what continues to motivate me, you know, learning new things. I mean, a whole aspect of our product, the Power BI stuff, is relatively new in our product. You know, that's been fascinating for me to learn, and trying to figure out how to solve a lot of the problems we did in more static reporting with a more interactive, you know, everyone's always talking about, you know, the sexy reports, you know, and Power BI is a tool that's great for us to leverage. So that's been great. You know, a lot of the stuff around AI and some of the partners we have who are starting to leverage AI, I find fascinating as well, because there's a lot of interesting things that can be done with AI to help solve problems. I'm really fascinated, particularly on kind of the research side of the world, how AI is going to play in, and how that might be leveraged into solutions as we continue.
Yeah. And so you also now, I mean, well, not recently, a while ago, but we're actually able to then reincorporate being a flight instructor again in what you're doing.
Well, that's a great...
Right? So like, you've kind of been able to, you know, bring it back to, well, let me revisit this thing that I really wanted to do.
Well, it's interesting because at some point, you know, it went away, like flying went away. I remember the number. I was 220 hours when I stopped. You know, for a period of time, I would randomly try to reach out and get back into it. And I don't know, our wife and I were at dinner one night, like 27 years later, since the last time I flew, 27 years.
Wow, that's a long time.
And we were talking about it. I'm like, oh, you would love this. We could do this. And she's like, why don't you do that?
Yeah,
like, why don't you do that anymore? And like, I'm like, she'll tell you, I'm the great excuse maker. And I couldn't come up with a reason why we couldn't do it. And I called the flight school like 2 days later, and the people who owned it when I was there still owned it.
Oh, still the same people. Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
And I went back, and I was really just going to go back and get my currency back and take some flights. And I don't know, like, it always irritated me I hadn't finished.
Yeah.
That's why I told that part of the story up front, is that, you know, I made it pretty far on my instructor certificate, and I just stopped. And it always irritated me I didn't finish it. Shortly after I got back to flying, I was like, oh, I got to finish this thing. And so I did, and, you know, now it's been interesting. I'm now at 1,080 hours. So
Wow.
almost 900 hours
How
later.
many students have you worked with?
Yeah. So I would guess all in all, I've probably flown with 50 to
Okay.
100 different students. I've had 6 go through and become private pilots.
Okay.
I'm fairly selective on who I instruct now
Okay.
because I am part-time. It's hard to be starting from scratch with people
Yeah,
all the
because
time.
you do that like at the end of your workday. Like this
Yes.
is like, and so it's got to be something that you really, really enjoy that you're like, all right, I'm done with work, close my computer, now let me drive to
Well,
work.
I would say after, the amount of hours I've done the instructing, it's not quite as effortless as it was at the beginning, but I'm always happy that
Yeah.
I'm there.
Yeah.
It's definitely a good way to kind of shift. We
Yeah.
deal with a lot of stress.
What are
in
your
our-
favorite kinds of students?
People who are really have all. Well, first of all, I kind of like people who are closer to my age.
Okay.
I will.
Because they're less risk takers, less like, trying to be an adrenaline junkie?
I
or-
think it's easier.
responsible?
I can instruct anyone, but I generally think it's easier to instruct people who have the same point of view
Okay.
or similar points of
Perspective, yeah.
perspective as you do. I think if you're a part-time instructor, teaching a part-time student is also easier. A lot of these kids are going through the program now, are flying 4 or 5 times a week.
Okay.
But I love people who show up the first time and we're like, I've just always wanted to do this and
Okay.
see what it's like. So, people really appreciate the experience because it's empowering to watch someone go from, it's a little bit like paint the kitchen thing we were talking about earlier, but on a much different scale.
Sure.
Because it's really powerful to watch someone go from not even knowing what anything in the
No
plane
idea,
does.
yeah.
And I'm not saying by the time you're a private pilot, you're an expert, but you are kind of a little expert on
Sure.
this thing, because
Relatively.
there's
yeah.
such a broad amount of information you have to gain in a period of time. So I find that,
utilize and process in real time.
yeah, and I find that really fulfilling because in the grand scheme of what we do, it's years and years sometimes to build out a software product where something like that can happen quicker in smaller iterations.
Do you get any cowboys?
I've had one or two, yeah.
Anybody you just got to grab the wheel back from and be like, you're done?
Yeah, that's happened once. There was one person in particular. I would say there are very few people who scare me, but when they do, I'm pretty quick
Not
to
fun.
say,
yeah,
I'm
I
not,
wouldn't
yeah.
either. Like,
Some people do it for the wrong reasons,
sure.
some people are there because they're like, I can do anything,
Mm-hmm.
and they aren't interested in taking the steps.
yeah.
So that can be challenging, but for the most part, if people are really willing to put that kind of commitment into it, most people are serious, and you don't find a lot of cowboys. But like I said, I had one time that I was not. Turned out.
What was he trying to do?
Oh, it was just
I'm assuming it was a he, because
it was interesting. He wanted to. In aviation, it's very checklist driven. It's very, you got to do A, B, and C. There's a reason we do all that. And he wasn't interested in following the checklist. He was, there was an incident because when he came to me, he already had his pilot's license. He was really just trying to get what we call a biennial flight review.
Okay.
And it was clear to me this guy should not be flying.
Shouldn't have had the original.
He shouldn't have had the original. So he came to me. I went to the chief instructor. I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to fly with this guy. I don't feel safe with him.
Yeah.
So he had a conversation. Another instructor tried with him, and then he eventually got a BFR. He rented a plane one day, and come to find out, he took off from Beverly Airport and flew to Provincetown, which is kind of the tip of Cape.
Yeah.
And it was 900 feet the whole way over the ocean, which is incredibly unsafe.
Yeah.
With kids on board, kind of yeah, it was, yeah. So yeah, I feel like I'm a pretty good judge of people like that, and so I never flew, and I never will fly with him again. So
yeah, that's crazy.
It is interesting though, because I read an interesting article on LinkedIn one time about like how the similarities how becoming a pilot is a great thing for someone who's an executive.
Okay.
You know, to learn. It really teaches problem solving. It really teaches,
well, and the importance of checklists.
Right?
Yeah.
So, confidence and really kind of judging yourself is today the day I should be doing this, right? Because it's a question you have to ask.
Exactly.
Is this the right,
If it's not, and it goes wrong,
And it's it's very problem solving oriented in that way. So
I never really thought about that, but that does actually make a lot of sense. Yeah.
So yeah.
So last question.
Okay.
Which is my typical last question.
Yep.
If you had to pick a person that you've come across, worked with, grew up with, whatever it may be, that you feel like had a huge influence on you.
Oh, this is an impossible question. There's like. Can I say 10? Like
no, you have to pick one. I'll let you. You can pick two if it's really that difficult. But like the person that you feel like you hear their voice, or like was just because this person was there. Here I am.
Yeah, I'm gonna caveat this by saying I'm gonna pick one.
Okay.
But I'm gonna tell you that my grandmother, who lived in our house, was the most influential person in my life ever.
I was thinking, honestly, in my mind, I was like, in the beginning, it sounded like that's where...
Like, if you never met Mimi Hobbs, you lost out in the world. Because she was the Energizer Bunny that kept going.
It just also sounds like, we talked about, like, all your problem solving, but, like, also, like, I want to be friends. Like, I want to know you.
Yeah.
Thing really kind of came from...
She was a special person, for sure. But, like, professionally... I talked about the database thing at my first job at Scudder. Marshall Dyson was this guy's name, and I don't think I would have ever. I'm not sure I would have ended up on the same trajectory had I. And it's interesting because
you had a different boss.
Yeah, my first boss, and it's interesting because we talk so much in this interview about like how I have kept people in my life my whole life. I never talked to him again.
Well, that's sad.
It's sad and strange. Like
weird,
we didn't have social media the way we do now.
True. Yeah, it would have been hard.
It was
to
more
keep
difficult.
up, yeah.
But I don't know. I think it was really empowering to come out of college and have someone be like, "Oh, you have a good idea, go with it."
Yeah, a champion like that.
Because so many people get these like autocrats, and those first.
People just want to keep you down. Yeah, like.
Yeah. No, he could.
Crap on everything you do.
Yeah, he was very empowering, and I really. And then that's why it was hard, because I've had a series of those people. I could name 10 without thinking very hard.
Yeah.
General Helms, that woman I'm talking about, was the most impressive person I was ever around, because she came into her room, she sat down, she had no idea what we were going to talk about, and within 5 minutes she was asking critical questions that were so on point.
Oh, wow.
I've never seen anyone process information the way that woman did. She was an amazing person too.
That is impressive.
I didn't work directly with her, so it was not.
Yeah, but just to see that in action.
Yeah. Well, and it was kind of confirming to me, because I've always been a person who was self-doubt. I was always a self-doubt person. But to like sit in the room and present to a person who's like that intelligent and that strong a person, and to like feel like you answered her questions in an intelligent way,
to
like
operate on the same level.
it was that was very empowering for me. I never had an experience like that ever again. So.
Nice. Well, thanks for sitting with me, Chris.
Yeah, this was fun.
I'm glad that, kind of everybody gets the opportunity to get to hear a little bit more about you.
Yes.
I know that our head of business development is highly interested in doing the real McCoy series to kind of dig a little bit more, but like this is a good starting point for kind of everybody to get the introduction and I think it helps, for everybody to kind of know the perspective and the thought process and just kind of the driver behind somebody like yourself, like to start your own business, to have this kind of career that you've had, and then just what's kind of pushing you forward and like helping people learn how to fly and still being that problem solver. So
Sure.
so
No,
for
this was
sitting
fun.
with us.
This was fun. Anytime, yeah. I'd
Awesome.
love to do it again.
Well, good chat.
Yeah.